Hello, everyone. I am Frank Place, Director of the CGIAR Research Program on Policies, Institutions, and Markets, or PIM for short. And I am pleased to welcome you to the PIM webinar on Determinants of Rural Youth Migration Throughout the Developing World. Our speaker today is Alan DeBra. Alan is a Senior Research Fellow in the Markets, Trade, and Institutions Division at the International Food Policy Research Institute. He also is a member of the PIM team, and he helps to coordinate our research on value chains. Prior to joining IFPRI, he was an assistant professor of economics at Williams College. In his research, Alan focuses on understanding the evolution of rural labor markets in developing economies and the effects of migration on source households. He has also conducted evaluations of conditional cash transfer programs and other agricultural interventions. Alan has a PhD in agricultural and resource economics from the University of California at Davis. Before I hand over to Alan, let me remind how we proceed. Our speaker will begin shortly with a presentation that you will see on your screens. The presentation will last for about 30 minutes. During the presentation, we invite listeners to send in questions via the chat window on the right side of your screens. We will collate the questions and group any that are similar in content and pose them to our speaker. And once we're in the Q&A session, we will have this back and forth with Alan on answering as many questions as we can. We are handling the questions in this way to make the best use of our 1 hour together. And we are recording the webinar and we'll make it available on our website shortly after the live event. So with that, I will turn it over to Alan. Welcome.
Well, thanks, Frank, and thank all of you for being online. I want to start my talk by motivating with really what I would call two statistical facts, if we can get the computer to work. And the first one is that the real motivation is that voluntary migration, rather than forced migration, we know that it plays a central role in economic development. So first fact is that countries with a higher GDP always have a lower share of labor in agriculture, meaning that migrants they may go to urban areas, they may go to other rural areas, but they always go somewhere. They move out of agriculture. It took me about 5 minutes, knowing this fact, it took me about 5 minutes to construct this graph, which shows little three-letter abbreviations for countries. And basically, I looked at the World Development Indicators. I took the log GDP per capita, the gross domestic product per capita, put it on the y-axis, and took the share of labor in agriculture and put it on the x-axis. And you'll see that up at the top, you see countries like LUX, Luxembourg, NOR, Norway, IRL is pretty clear, Ireland, all have high GDPs and very low shares of the workforce or labor force that work in agriculture. Whereas on the other end of this kind of curve that's drawn out by countries, you see Ethiopia at the very back and Rwanda and Madagascar with very high shares of their labor force in agriculture, and a much lower GDP per capita. So we know that as countries move, they don't all move the same way up this essentially curve, but they move in different ways, but they always move to having lower shares of labor working in agriculture and always move towards, as they move towards higher GDP. Okay, second fact is that if we look at the 10 largest economies in the developing world, these are the 10 countries with the largest populations, in the developing world between 1996 and 2015. They're all growing at different rates, but they all had a decline in the rural share of their population. We see that decline is taking place at different speeds, but even in Ethiopia, we see noticeable, which has the highest rural population share of these countries. Even in Ethiopia, it dropped by 6, 7, 8 percentage points in those 20 years. And even in countries that were very urbanized in 1996, like Brazil and Mexico, their rural population share is also dropping. So we see, again, that this is a common trend throughout the world, that rural population share is declining as economies are becoming better off. Okay. I'm not going to say much in this talk about international migration because it's a bit more complicated than I want to go through, but particularly from a rural perspective. But I want to say a couple of things to begin with. One is that many small countries really rely a lot on remittances for a substantial share of their GDP. Nepal is a great example, but even some bigger countries like Bangladesh receive 8% or so of their GDP from remittances. And you know, along those lines, international migration is a pretty important feature of several large economies: Bangladesh, Pakistan, the Philippines, Mexico. And recently, I've looked at this. I don't have a graph on this in this talk, but where there is data, it turns out that international migrants often originate from rural areas. We don't really know if they first step to urban areas or not because the data aren't really there. And I'm gonna kind of table that for now, in part because it's really hard to look at micro data on this issue, and I'll explain that in a little while. Just to show you these remittances, though, as a share of GDP for some of the smaller economies, looking at population estimates, again, from the World Development Indicators, look, you know, Nepal had about 30 million people, and remittances over GDP remittances are 32% of their GDP. Some of the smaller countries have similar shares, Haiti through Liberia with 25 to 30%, and El Salvador at 16% is also quite high. Larger economies, as I said, Bangladesh with 160 million people, still even have 8% of their GDP, which is much larger because of the much larger population coming from remittances. Okay, so with those two facts in mind, we're going to kind of switch gears slightly and study youth migration. So in the rest of my talk, I'm going to first motivate why do we think youth migration is interesting relative to just migration, or why is it a specifically interesting type of migration. I want to talk a bit about the data that I'm going to use in the talk, which I think is unique relative to other papers on really what we're going to call internal migration. I want to talk about what factors lead, then the meat of what I'm going to talk about are the factors that lead to internal migration by youth, and what factors matter most. Is it individual characteristics, household characteristics, or village characteristics that help us predict which types of people migrate? And I'm going to answer an interesting question, actually, which is how much do youth differ from young adults? So we're going to look at the same factors among young adults who we're going to call age 25 to 34, and then we'll sum up and take questions. So first, what we want to know, there's a substantial interest in what are we going to do with rural youth in development circles right now, meaning there's a concern that mechanization is reducing jobs throughout the world, and we aren't. There's a youth bulge in many countries, and we're not 100% sure like where are the jobs going to come from, right? So that's sort of the meat of one of the major concerns people have right now. Well, it turns out that youth or rural youth are in the process of making many life decisions at the same time. So migration is potentially one of these decisions, but they're making decisions about when to leave school. And particularly after you get to about age 15, you think, oh man, school is a drag. I don't really want to be in school anymore. And your parents say, well, you're going to make more money if you stay in school for another year. Hopefully they don't use for another 5 years, because that sounds like way too long of a time horizon. You're making decisions about whether and to whom to marry. You're making decisions about where to live and then where to live. So that gets rolled up into the question of whether or not to migrate, either for labor or for other reasons, which could be to marry, or to join the army, or what have you. And then if you do decide to migrate, where is a key decision. Do you stay somewhat close to home? Do you go to the biggest city in your country? Do you go to a secondary city? And these kinds of questions are really kind of crucial in helping knowing better how these questions can be answered is crucial to policymakers who may want to know well, where their population is going to live in 10 years so that we can plan how best to build roads or plan roads, plan new roads, plan new hospitals, etc. Okay, so there's a big opportunity right now to do better research on these questions related to either migration in general or youth migration. And that opportunity is that there's a number of new panel data sets that have become available, some of which that tracks migrants, and these surveys are they're both nationally representative and much larger than surveys that were available in the past. So a couple of the sources that, well, I'm going to use 3 different types of sources in this talk. One are the LSMS, or Living Standards Measurement Survey, integrated surveys in agriculture that are being conducted in Africa. And I'm going to use 2 of those, but also IFPRI has done some panel surveys in South Asia, in Bangladesh and Pakistan. And I'm going to use the Indonesia Family Life Survey as well, which is a very rich panel survey that's been taking place in India. The last round was in 2014, and I think another round may occur, but I talked to the survey manager last month, and he wasn't sure. They hadn't written a grant yet. So what I'm going to require for inclusion is that I can track individuals in the panel over time. So I'm going to be able to know, this was a requirement for inclusion in this set of surveys. I looked at a much larger set of surveys, and there were a number of panel surveys, or supposedly panel surveys, in which I could not track the individuals, so we had to throw those out from being used. And then, therefore, I'm going to be able to track migrants as a flow rather than a stock. And what I want to explain that concept quickly. If we think about, any of the 3 of us sitting in this room, Frank, Evgenia, and myself, none of us, I believe, were born in Washington, D.C. Yep. They're both nodding at me, and all of us have migrated here from somewhere else. So if we thought about the stock of people living in the Washington area, or the DMV as we like to call it, many people were not actually born here, were in migrants in a sense. Some of us internationally, some of us are rural urban, or in my case, urban or suburban migrants, I guess. So the stock of migrants here in Washington is quite high. What I'm going to measure instead in this case is the flow. So I'm going to be able to determine people who moved between the first survey that I'm studying and the latter survey, and that's how I'm going to define migration. That allows me to control better for the types of people who stay home versus the types of people who migrate. So we're going to be able to look at the determinants of migration using that baseline of people who were at the home area to begin with, which is going to give us a little bit of a richer way to look at migration instead of looking at the stock of migrants relative to, say, the population in a place. This is actually the reason that it's really complicated to study international migration in one of these data sets, because no matter what you do, no matter how big your data set, the flow of international migration, it turns out, is a little bit of a statistical rarity. So it becomes really hard to find the migrants. I think the only data set that's listed there that it was reasonably easy was Indonesia, but even in Bangladesh, where there's a lot of migration, there were less than 100, and I believe in Nigeria there were 1 or 2 international migrants that we could identify. Okay, so what I'm going to do, so thinking about research questions, I want to look at whether there are consistent determinants of migration among youth aged 15 to 24 across this set of quite variable countries. And we want to look at whether there are consistent individual, household, or village characteristics that predict later migration. We're going to look at how migration among youth differ from young adults. And then how prevalent are various types of migration, like where do people go? So some of the data sets are going to be good for answering that question, but not other ones. Okay, I'm going to use a consistent set of variables across surveys, which is a decision that's made to make tables look better a little bit, but also to make the analysis very comparable across countries. So it's difficult, for instance, to come up with a consistent set of asset indicators to do that, because the surveys are a little bit different from one another. A question that I had to ask myself was how to treat age. What I decided to do was follow people who should be aged 15 to 24 or 25 to 34 by the final survey used, rather than examining 15 to 24-year-olds at baseline. So this is a question, and the rationale is that if we look at 15 to 24-year-olds at baseline, a lot of them are still in school and they might migrate after their youth. So it makes more sense to follow the people and see what the decisions are that they're making after they've turned 15 to 24, relative to at later ages, which are going to differ by survey. I'm going to use their education level in the final survey, since many of the younger respondents are still in school at baseline. Okay. Now, the second question is how to define what we mean by migration. And I'm going to use two different definitions. And one I'm going to call the broad definition, and the other narrow, for better or for worse. The reason I'm going to use there are two reasons to use a broad definition, as broad a definition as possible, not just looking at migration for work. And that's because a set of papers have shown over time that migration for any reason has economic consequences. So specifically, Rosenzweig and Stark, in a famous paper a long time ago now, 1989, that's 30 years, show that there's an economic rationale to migrate for marriage. And there's a really nice paper by Kathleen Beagle and co-authors that show that migration this is using data from Kagera in Tanzania, show migration for any reason is correlated with higher consumption. So people who left the village, no matter why they left the village, they're better off if they left the village relative to people who didn't. Not only that, but they show that if you went farther away from the village, the farther you went, the better off you are. So I'm going to use two different definitions. One is that this broad definition, which is any reason, and we're going to see very different demographic characteristics, not surprisingly, using that definition. And then I'm going to eliminate people who stated that they reported that they left for marriage or to join family elsewhere. Okay, so let's look at some of these migration rates by country. So here I have a graph with the probability of migration by people's projected age by country. We see that this is, again, any migration by youth. So we see that there are differing patterns by country. People in, for example, Tanzania and Nigeria seem to become more and more likely to migrate as they get older in this age range. Whereas in Bangladesh and Indonesia, there's almost a parabolic relationship. As they get older, they get more likely to migrate, and then they become less likely. And same thing in Indonesia, with a peak at 20 years old. In Pakistan, we see that there's less migration in general, and a slightly different pattern. Second piece of data I want to show you is are youth more likely to migrate than young adults? And that, again, varies by country, but in general, you could say that the answer is yes. People in Bangladesh and Indonesia in particular are far more likely to migrate as youth than as young adults, calling young adults 25 to 34-year-olds. It's not so true in Nigeria and Tanzania. They're about the same likelihood, and in Pakistan, I'm going to guess we couldn't tell you that that's statistically different from one another either, though it seems like people are slightly less likely to migrate as young adults. So youth is actually an important time for migration to occur, is what this graph is telling us. Third, I want to show you, this is the stark definitional difference by the gender of youth migration. So many of these countries are largely patrilineal, meaning that women move to get married. There are probably parts of particularly Tanzania that are matrilineal. But if we look at the share of migrants that are female, using the broad definition, it's always higher, and it's starkly higher in Bangladesh and Pakistan in particular, although it's higher throughout. So we see that males are more likely to be kind of migrating for economic reasons other than for marriage or to join family, and females are more likely to be migrating for other reasons. Okay, where do youth migrants go? So again, there's not much data on international migrants, but there were 3 surveys where we had really good information on where any youth migrants, or migrants in general, went. Indonesia, Pakistan, and in Tanzania. We see that in Indonesia and Pakistan, we see a lot of migration that takes place actually within rural areas, and sort of surprisingly little rural urban migration that's going to major cities. So what we're seeing is that there's actually substantial rural urban migration that's going to secondary cities, we can infer from these statistics, which is helpful from a planning perspective. Okay, so let's turn to trying to tease out some results in a multivariate framework. What I'm going to do is regress an indicator variable for somebody who migrates by the second period, the second data set, on a set of individual characteristics, households characteristics, and village characteristics. The individual characteristics are going to be things like the age, it's not a baseline, gender, and level of education measured in the final survey. The household characteristics I'm largely going to use household consumption in this context. In the paper, there are a couple of other variables, and the results are similar to what I'm going to show you. Actually, they're non-results, so I'm not going to show them to you. And then village characteristics, which include things like population density and land per capita, to see if there are some drivers at the village level that are leading to more people migrating or not. The idea is to tease out some of the most important characteristics for specific, the broad or the narrow types of migration. Okay, so let's first look at the individual characteristics that determine broad migration by youth. We'll go to young adults at some point. I think we're just going to look at narrow migration. What I want to highlight here, the next slide is the same. I'm going to highlight here in the box at the top. Note that gender in all cases, once we control for other factors, is negatively correlated with broad migration. That means that women are more likely to migrate in broad terms than men are, except in Indonesia. Not surprisingly, age has a positive relationship with migration in all of these countries. So as you get older, you're more likely to migrate. And using no schooling as the base category, we look at whether people have less than primary school education, primary school complete, secondary school complete, or more than secondary school. And in general, there's a positive relationship between education level and migration. There's a little bit of an anomaly in Pakistan. Okay, we're going to highlight those results, particularly in Bangladesh, Indonesia, and Tanzania in this slide. Okay, now I'm going to switch to narrow migration, the narrow migration measure, and we're going to see a bunch of these characteristics change fairly dramatically. So note that as I switch from one to the other, we're going to see two things really happen. And one is that the gender variable becomes the coefficients on the gender variable become positive and significant in most countries other than Tanzania, which means that once we remove marriage migration and joining family migration from the definition, we see that men are more likely, or men are more likely to be migrating. Second thing here is that schooling levels, particularly high schooling levels, become more important, where people who have secondary school or more than secondary school, they also become those factors become more important as well. Okay, last thing I want to do in this context is I want to switch to the young adults and see how these factors differ. And actually what we see, I'm going to toggle back once more to show, first of all, age doesn't matter anymore whatsoever. So once you're anywhere between 25 and 34, you're equally likely to migrate, apparently. The men are far more likely to migrate than the women again, and these coefficients are bigger in most countries. And then education becomes less important, with the exception of in Tanzania, where it's actually more important. Okay, so we find that migration flows are heavily influenced by gender. Males are more likely to just summarize, more likely to leave for non-family reasons. Age matters among youth, but not among young adults. Education matters more for youth than young adults as well. And we're seeing substantial heterogeneity across countries, which shouldn't surprise us that we're seeing this heterogeneity based on the earlier statistics. Okay, next question I want to ask is there a relationship between youth migration and household consumption? The household consumption measured at baseline. So how well off is the household at baseline, and then does that affect the probability that somebody migrates? So this is controlling, again, for all of those individual characteristics. And I didn't have a consumption measure for Indonesia. So if I look at the probability, one thing we might hypothesize, let's step back and think that we believe there are credit constraints to migration. So if there were credit constraints to migration, households with lower per capita consumption are going to be less likely to migrate than households with somewhat higher per capita consumption. And we might even hypothesize, in fact, I can think of a paper on China published in the late 90s, which purported to show an inverse U shape. So we'd expect an inverse U shape, meaning in this relationship, meaning that poor people are less likely to migrate, they get better off, they become more likely to migrate, and then rich people don't migrate because they have ways of making money that are really good, even in agriculture and rural areas. Okay, in only one of the cases do we see anything remotely like that in that parabolic relationship that inverse parabolic relationship we might have expected, which is in Pakistan. And given I've put a confidence interval around there, and I can draw an infinite number of straight lines. Actually, the straight line that's most interesting is the one with no slope that I can draw right through that confidence interval, saying that there doesn't seem to be any relationship there. If anything, poor people in other countries seem more likely to migrate, which kind of flies in the face of the hypothesis of credit constraints. So does that mean that there are no credit constraints against migration? Let's turn back to that thought later, because that doesn't necessarily, recall that I'm using nationally representative data here. What we can say for sure is that there's not much correlation with consumption, or for that matter, with household demographic composition or characteristics of the household head. So if anything, we're seeing this negative correlation between migration and consumption expenditures. I want to come back to that later. I also want to say that in this estimation framework, there's another hypothesis out there that as people see other people in the village that are better off, they become more likely to migrate. This is called the relative deprivation hypothesis, that was studied by Stark and Taylor in a very small data set in 1991. And not surprisingly, with these big data sets and this more robust estimation framework, we see no evidence of that relationship at all. Okay, let's turn to village characteristics. Specifically, we're going to look at the village land per capita, the share of households with off-farm work in a village, which tells us a bit about the how robust that local or rural economy is, and then population density where I had it. Again, in all three of these countries, when I add these variables to the framework, there's some evidence in Bangladesh and Pakistan that characteristics matter, but they actually matter in the opposite way we might have expected. Village land per capita, we might think, oh, as land as oh, actually that's working the right way. We would have expected that as places get more dense, people have more densely populated people have more reason to move out. That seems to be the case in Pakistan, but not in the other places. The share of households with off-farm work, we might have expected to work the other way with a positive coefficient, and we don't see that in Bangladesh. And in Indonesia, we see population density also inversely related to migration. So the possible explanation here is that high returns to migration are outstripping anything possible on the farm or near farm in any of these contexts. And so that's why the individual characteristics matter more. Okay. In conclusion, migration, just kind of thinking through all of the facts we've had, migration to secondary cities appears quite important to youth, as well as to the primary cities. But when we have data, we see that there is migration going on to secondary cities. Individual characteristics, notably education, are an important determinant of migration. And that's different among older or young adult migrants, as we've termed them. We've seen no or negative correlations between initial household welfare and youth migration. Note that I've only used representative surveys, and there's some really nice papers showing that there are localized credit constraints against migration, or that giving people money to migrate has catalyzed migration in, for instance, in Northwest Bangladesh. So this doesn't say that that result is wrong. That's saying that that in a nationally representative framework, we might miss those localized credit constraints, and it may be therefore more pronounced in less densely populated areas, or areas that are far more removed from urban areas. Okay. Lastly, I want to say that migration is really heterogeneous across countries, which you should have seen from all these varying coefficients everywhere, and more high quality data like these examples would shed more light on migrants' experiences in more countries. And I've included some references that you might want to see as part of the talk, and so those will be on the slides, and thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much, Alan. That was very informative, and we're starting to get some questions trickling in. So, maybe I'll ask you a set of two questions that are around your definitions of your age groups. So there was a first question that came in about wondering whether you were able to do any further disaggregation of this, say within the youth, of looking at the 15 to 19 and the 20 to 24 separately. Now your regression results seem to indicate that in some cases that age within that group matters. So I guess because the question came in, given that there could be different levels of experiences for the younger cohort of that group and access to resources. So maybe you can take that and explain why that age variable comes out in your regressions as it does in that case. And then a second question that's related to age is because you've defined it as the groups, the age that they were at the end line instead of the baseline, that means that you may have some, say, 20 to 24-year-old migrants in that time period, but they're not captured, they're bumped up to the young adult. So have you tried to analyze the findings using different definitions of that?
Those are both good questions. At one point, I know I did the analysis at the 15 to 19 and 20 to 24-year-old. I think I was trying to do the analysis actually at the specific age level. So like among, I know I did 15 to 19 and 20 to 24-year-olds, and I think the reason that it's not in this talk is that it wasn't as interesting as you'd like it to be, basically. The issue here is that there is a big issue, which is that 15 to 19-year-olds are far more likely to still be in school than 20 to 24-year-olds. So it's almost worth doing the analysis. And then there are also sample size issues that you run into. But these samples are big enough to be able to show those individual age propensities to migrate without feeling bad about it, which is also kind of nice. Without feeling bad that you're showing. What I mean by without feeling bad about it is you're not showing 50 people. Those are a couple hundred. So there's some real meat to those figures. Yeah. That said, so that's a good issue to think about. I thought a lot about the end line versus baseline issue when I was setting up the paper, and one of the issues you run into is that people are misclassified in one survey versus the other, and that's actually a big reason that we threw out surveys, was because you end up with 30% in one case misclassified, or where you really just don't know how old the person is, because 30% didn't follow like a pattern that you'd expect, versus say these surveys that I've used, we only have 1 or 2% at most, and most is probably Nigeria in this case. I mean, the Indonesia one is extremely careful, for instance. I guess the reason we decided to do, we thought about trying to track when people migrated, but I don't think it's always in the data. And so that became the real reason that I think I didn't try to track when they migrated, like did they migrate when they were actually youth or not. That said, I don't think it's that bad in all the surveys. It's hard to remember the work we did with 5 different surveys, of course, as well.
Good. Thanks. A question came in about on the graphs that you had looking at the proportion of female migrants according to your broad or narrow definition. So actually, there was just a comment that they were kind of surprised about the high level of female migration. I think you have explained it by largely by marriage or family, but you might want to expand on that. But maybe in that line also, we noticed that actually in the case of Tanzania, it's not the case, that there's a lot of high proportion of women migrating even in the narrow definition. Do you have any insights as to why that might have happened in that particular case?
Why? No, I don't really have a good sense of why. I mean, I would guess, I would speculate that the society is a bit different. We have a lot of actually, a lot of the other countries are all fairly substantially Muslim, so they're going to be a bit more stuck in traditional gender roles than Tanzania. Tanzania, not to say there's no Muslim influence in Tanzania, but it's not as big as in the other 4 countries actually in this case. I shouldn't. What I tried to explain is that in rural areas that follow patrilineal traditions, what happens is women usually, when they decide to get married, or someone decides for them that they're going to get married, they tend to move to another location, either another village, so that would be a rural to rural type of migration, or to a secondary city, or a more like a county seat or something. So the with the female migration, it shouldn't surprise us that we see a lot of female migration in this age range, because a lot of people aren't married when they're 15, and a lot of people are married by the time they're 24. So that's, I think helps explain why we see that with that broad definition.
A couple other questions I had around kind of the definition of migration. So is migration for education of something that you can
Yes.
learn about in your data sets, and is that important?
So yes, so what'll happen is, so yes, people will migrate to go to a better school, a school that they have access to for whatever reason in another area. What often the problem is that people will have migrated to that place, and maybe they're coded as being an educational migrant, right? But then they stayed there and got a job there. So then what do we call that? What do we call that kind of migration? And it's much easier to, and that happens all the time, right? Like you see that all the time in developing countries. So instead of trying to classify, that's why I have this broad and the narrow definition. I didn't want to classify those people as specifically non-labor migrants when, you know, they were probably labor migrants to begin with. They just went to school for 3 years to start with.
Good. No, that's helpful. And then, because you've noticed you've noted the importance of rural to rural migration, does that mean also that there's returning migrants coming in the or you know,
right?
In the households?
That's a good question. There often are returning migrants. I haven't studied that in this paper, so that would be something that one could imagine trying to look at it in further work on using these types of data sets, because you'll see the return ease. The problem, though, again with this type of data set is somebody may have migrated. We wrote a paper for the LSMS about 10 years ago, where we tried to include modules that people could use to try to track return people who left and then returned. The problem you might run into is people may have been there in the first survey, left, returned, and you never know that they were ever migrants.
Right.
So you need a survey module to study that.
Yeah.
And you can find that on the World Bank website, or email me if you want to see a survey module about that.
Good. So then one question came in about whether you could, since you noted that there was at least two different types of significant migration. One is rural to rural, and one rural to secondary towns, at least.
Yeah.
You might have high numbers of samples. Did you try to look at those decisions separately at all?
I have not, in large part because when I was writing the paper, it was pushed in a different direction. That's an interesting issue. The issue, though, is that you don't have it for all of the surveys, and so I was trying to keep a lot of the analysis as similar as possible across the 5 countries. Although that's one where I think you're right. It's really kind of interesting to see, like, are there differences between the rural and the rural, any rural urban kind of migration? And I think there are probably samples to show that.
Okay, yeah, I mean, like, for instance, what comes to mind perhaps related to that question was perhaps the education level might vary, that might be more likely to drive people to a town rather than rural to rural. Good. So let me come to some of the results, findings that you had, I guess. So one question was about somebody noted that in many other studies, it seems to show that relative deprivation does, let's say, of the local characteristics, maybe drive people out. Maybe it's poor soils or other kinds of things that you didn't find much in your village characteristics, and so that person was a bit surprised that you didn't find the same so much on the village characteristics. But maybe that's related to the sets of variables that you had at your disposal, or
it could be. There may be two answers to that question. One is that I think a lot of other studies haven't been able to control as well for baseline characteristics as I'm able to here. And that's one of the reasons that other studies find relative deprivation results that are spurious, essentially. In terms of that's one possibility. A second possibility is that relative deprivation doesn't matter to youth, but it matters to other potential other types of migrants. Second point on like people being driven, pushed to migrate by poor soils or something along those lines. Similarly, that may be a bigger factor in explaining migration in general than in terms of youth migration. I think once you focus on the youth, it seems to me that their individual character. I'm going to stick to this. I think that people who the kids who become more educated are and have the right types of characteristics are going to be more likely to be finding themselves a way to migrate than others, even holding other things constant.
Okay, good. So then kind of a related question. A couple came in and were asked about the different roles of other possible explanatory variables. So again, it was like, of course, we're always looking for those.
Yep, that's right.
So in particular was whether there was a possibility to get some information about infrastructure, local infrastructure, whether that had any kind of motivating factor, you know, the roads, access to electricity, those kinds of things. Similar vein to the last question. The other thing was about perhaps looking at some social variables like marriage rates. I mean, you know, whether those kinds of things could be useful and available. And then also on the pull, maybe the pull side or the incentive side was, did you look at all at different kinds of policies that governments may have in place to help, which might be in support of migration? Those could be a factor.
Right. This is always a fun topic with migration research because you can never control for everything, and there aren't really that many randomized experiments. I haven't looked at policies. That's an interesting one. In terms of like things like marriage rates and infrastructure, I'm pretty sure in most of the regression results, I have village fixed effects in them. So essentially, when you're looking at those age results, I'm controlling for that. I back off of that to show you I backed off of that. I'm almost sure this is how the analysis went. It's been a little while. Only for looking at those village characteristics. So that's when I backed off and used more like regional or province level fixed effects instead of the village level fixed effects. But I'm pretty sure in most of the regressions there are village fixed effects to absorb that variation. It would be, that said, I could look again at the surveys to see if things like infrastructure were available. Marriage rates, one could theoretically construct from the data depending upon how you wanted to. The marriage rate, I think there are a million different ways that I could think of, or at least a few that I could think of defining it, and so it would be harder to think about. At least it's not the most since there are a lot of different ways to define that, it's hard to think of how you would define that in a convincing manner to put in a regression.
Right. Good. Yeah. One thing related to the village characteristics. So you didn't find that land per capita had much significance. Some other studies by colleagues, when they look at it at the individual household level, have found more of a relationship between, say, expected land inheritance and reason to migrate. So I was wondering, in your data set, did you actually have also at the household level that same variable or not?
The land per capita. I think we did look at it at the household level. I don't think it was significant.
Okay.
Because we must have.
So again, it could be a difference between having national samples and
it could be nationally representative, and it could be like in specific areas. I think there are certainly variables that I think could matter in local areas, but when you want to make broad, if you think about policy or migration in a more broad sense, it doesn't necessarily matter.
So there was a couple questions related to understanding the characteristics around migration a little bit better that I know wasn't necessarily part of your study, but maybe you can point to others. So a question came in about whether we know, what do we know about how decisions are made? Is it an individual decision, a household decision?
That's a great question.
Those kinds of things. And is there, you had shown some information on remittances, which came from a different data set.
That did, yeah.
But in your data sets, is there any information on remittances? And is it able to, are you able to tell from whom that's coming from? Is it from the young adults or the youth?
Right, good question. Those are great questions. When I don't know, actually, in any of these 5 data sets, whether there's remittance data. I didn't look for it, so I don't actually know, because we didn't study that.
Right.
In terms of how the decisions are made, that's a great question, and my sense is that there's a bit of I think it's a combination. It's not easy to model. It's a combination between an individual making decisions and a household making decisions. So maybe not surprisingly, if you think about anybody who has a 15 to 24-year-old, whether the decisions aren't necessarily all their own. They need to know how much their parents, I guess, are going to insure them if things go wrong. They need to know how sure they are that there is going to be an opportunity at the destination, or even what the types of destinations are. So I think it's very much, there are individual aspects to the decision, and there are household and even community aspects to the decision. So if I know the China example best, but like if you're finishing middle school in China and you're in a village and half your village is in Shenzhen working in factories, you know how to get a job in Shenzhen, so you go.
Yeah.
We actually had a question about the network.
So I haven't studied networks in this particular paper, but I've studied in other papers. A lot of times these migration decisions, particularly not the marriage or the follow family decisions, are being made through networks. And again, that was a little bit beyond what I was doing in this case, but you see the networks really matter to determining where people go. I think in a paper John Giles and I did, we showed that 45% of Chinese migrants knew somebody at the destination. No, not just somebody, knew a family member at the destination before they went. So that just kind of underscores how, I mean, that's having a relatively close relative at the destination really helps, but then knowing somebody from the village helps as well. And so that's driving, I think, a lot of that, those decisions.
So maybe 2 questions that are linked about how improving our understanding through better data. So you've made use of the kind of standard questionnaires that have been going out, and not necessarily for the purpose of studying migration, yet they're useful for it. But are there some other kinds of questions that could be just added to those standard ones that would be greatly beneficial for migration research? So that's one question. And then a second one is that you were just talking about some understanding a bit more about the characteristics of where they go. And I know that these surveys don't necessarily follow people when they leave the household, but are there some good panels being developed that actually study both what's happening in the sending village plus what's happening in places where people are going?
A lot of the data sets I used here, not all of them, but definitely the Tanzania and the Indonesia, both are tracking people to where they went, and so that it's kind of complicated to figure out where they are. I think I'd have to look again at the Pakistan one, but I think it did some, because I think it was every year for a few years. So I think they were actually doing some work tracking people as well. Maybe not the whole household, but something along those lines. And the Malawi ISA data has tracked people as well. I've been meaning to add it, but it hasn't happened yet to this paper. it got dropped for various reasons, largely because it was too close to Tanzania for the donor. So yes, there are some tracking surveys. Thinking about improving our understanding through better data, one thing that is sort of one thing that could be done, and I can send a link to this to anybody who's interested, is to look at the survey modules Gerald Carletto and I put together a number of years ago, again for the LSMS program, where we basically thought through all the types of migration that could be occurring, how you might track that through a survey, and did a large survey review. So I think it's an underutilized resource actually at this point. So
the question came in to pose the question whether there's anything we could say about vulnerability of migrants. I guess you started off the presentation by looking at voluntary, but maybe there was a question whether when observing such large numbers, say, of women migrating, whether that's whether it's strictly voluntary or if there could be other factors involved.
So there are certainly other. I mean, there are other factors. What I mean by voluntary versus involuntary migration is that people in more like refugee situations are leaving because of risks that they foresee at home. That's a factor that leads to migration, and maybe they don't properly perceive the risks that they're going to experience at the destination. But when people feel there is a risk to their personal, a sort of grave risk to their personal safety, that's when we see what I would call involuntary migration taking place in refugee situations occurring. What I've stated some grand statistics about migrants making people better off when they move. You have to remember that's on average. So on average, people become twice as well off when they migrate. Averages are averages, so there are always people who don't do better when they migrate, and that's to some extent what I mean by people who are probably more vulnerable and are able to migrate from rural areas may be more vulnerable when they get to the urban areas, in part because they don't have that insurance policy, which is going back home to fall back on. It's not that much better at home, but the evidence on the average is extremely positive for migration, whether it's internal or international.
Oh, that's good. So a related question was, you had presented this graphic about the difference between male and female migration for the youth.
Yeah.
Now, do you see something similar for the young adults?
No, it's not similar for the young adults. So the young adults are much more likely to already have been married. So there isn't as much of a similar.
So the broad and the narrow ones
are far closer, I think, and that makes it more interesting to show among the youth rather than young adults.
So in that case, then it is more male dominated.
It becomes more male dominated. That's right.
Good. No, that's very good. So maybe in terms of like follow up with this, is there are there? I guess you've on this particular paper, what you were asked to do, and what you've done very well, is look at the determinants of migration. Yes. And then you haven't necessarily looked at the impacts, but perhaps that could be done with simply same data.
Yeah, actually, I haven't looked at them in these data sets. I've written a review paper that's on the previous slide, which is at the top, coming out this year in the annual review of resource economics, which talks about the implications for rural livelihoods of migration out of rural areas, both thinking about like how do migrants, the paper really goes into a lot of the outcomes, looking at whether it affects agricultural productivity or production, which is always a concern. If the productive people are moving out, does that affect agricultural production? The answer is no, it doesn't seem to. And then also on how does it affect risk profiles and incomes in rural areas. So that would be interesting to follow up in the context of these kind of nationally representative data sets with more robust framework. It's complicated, but it could certainly be done.
Right, great. Maybe one last question I have for you. So you've obviously been putting these results out into the global discourse on migration, which is very valuable. As we've seen that there's a lot of different results that are found, and that a lot of assumptions being made in the global discourse about migration. At the national level, so one of the findings is that the results differ across countries a bit. Not all of them, but some of them do. And so then, are there ways and means of trying to get these results put into national level policy discourses, or are there mechanisms and partnerships for doing that?
Yes, there certainly are. It would, in this context, we were trying to go kind of at a global level, but it's certainly, I think, interesting to note for national governments when they have higher or lower rates relative to the average. What I mean, to me, I think the way that these results might be most useful is in terms of thinking about planning, development planning, because as I was saying before, really what we care about from our infrastructure's perspective is not where we are now, but where we need to be 10 years from now. Or that's what we should be worrying about. And in rapidly growing contexts, it's easy to build infrastructure that becomes useless 5 years later. And we'd like to see, I think it would be worthwhile, I mean, think of all the rural Chinese schools that are out there with taxation on the second child that led people not to have the second child. There's a lot of misused infrastructure, and I think we could be, if we knew a bit better how both our demographics were changing, but how they're moving as well, we'd be able to. That would help governments with plans for following years. So I think that's the way we should think about getting this into the development discourse at the national level.
Great. Well, thanks very much, Alan. I found it very informative. I'm always a big fan of these cross-country comparisons because they really help us to understand really what's generalizable and not. And so that's very valuable to adding to our knowledge base. So thank you once again, and thanks to everybody online. And you can look at up on our website, and you'll see the recording there shortly. Thanks again.
Thank you.